Hello everyone, my name is Chris. Today, I'm going to talk about the topic Valuation and Behavior in Climate Mitigation, Modeling the Willingness to Pay Gap. In part 1, I will first introduce the research question with a simple real-life example. Imagine our friend Alex answering a survey about how much she's willing to pay for climate change mitigation. Suppose the environmental improvement is worth £300 per year to Alex. In the survey, she compares the two states of the world before and after the improvements, and reports a value of £300. However, in reality, she actually contributes only £80. Now the problem is, if she really values climate change highly, why is she under-contributing? The literature shows that there are two commonly used frameworks for measuring willingness to pay. The first is Hicksian compensating variation, which measures the welfare value of the environmental improvement. This is closer to what Alex answered in the survey. The second approach is much more familiar, the optimization problem, which tends to better model behavioral responses. Many empirical and experimental studies treat the gap as a hypothetical bias or as a moral expression factor. However, in this research, we argue that even without hypothetical bias, the two values diverge structurally. We compare the two models mentioned and show that a wage always arises endogenously. We further propose that observability could be a factor in closing the gap. And most importantly, we claim that the willingness to pay is derived from the two approaches answer fundamentally different economic questions, and therefore the gap is structural rather than purely biased. Part 2 is the model construction. We assume the utility function to depend on private consumption, willingness to pay, environmental improvement, and moral satisfaction, and we assume additively separable for simplicity, and assume all utility functions are concave. First, we show the compensating variation under this utility function. Willingness to pay is defined implicitly by the formula here, and it is an implied welfare measure, and it is not chosen. And we further assume a partial equilibrium here, W bar, to capture the hypothetical environment in the survey. This is an idea I'm currently working on, and I will expand further at the end of the presentation. Next, we see the optimization problem. W star is the value that maximizes the utility function. We see that individuals actively choose their willingness to pay level, and it is a value that solves the classic problem, marginal benefits equals marginal cost. Under certain assumptions, and we will assume that an interior solution does exist. Having these two values in mind, we can now compare them to see whether they differ. We define the wage as W star minus WCB. This is also the approximate formula for the gap between Alex's answer and behavior. We found that wage exists generically in our framework. The proof is in the appendix of the paper. However, under the general form of the optimization problem, we cannot determine the sign of the wage. Still, with sufficiently weak social image incentives, it is more likely that behavioral willingness to pay is lower than stated willingness to pay. This usually fits the survey environment where social image incentives and reputational return are low. We further look at when the gap can be eliminated. We found that although the gap generally arises, a coincidence occurs when the compensating variation payment satisfies the behavioral first-order condition. This may sound very technical, but we propose a much more straightforward mechanism that can help. The role of observability. In the paper, we wrote it as a formal proposition. In the appendix, we prove that observability can shift both valuation willingness to pay and behavioral willingness to pay. Therefore, three cases arise by manipulating observability: under-contribution, valuation consistency, and over-contribution. Here is a graphical illustration of an increase in social image return. Initially, there is a disconnect between Alex's behavior and her survey answer. It is an under-contribution. When we increase observability, both her behavior and her answer shift upwards, potentially reaching the orange point, where her behavioral and answer are consistent. However, this is only an ideal situation since it's hard to establish the exact sensitivity of both curves to observability. Nevertheless, the intuition behind the models leads to some simple policy implications. First, consistent with many previous studies, including Androni's, individuals often derive social image benefits from observable pro-environmental actions. Therefore, when contributions are more visible, reputational incentives increase behavioral contributions. Policies that enhance observability, such as public recognition or visible commitments, can potentially reduce the gap between stated willingness to pay and actual behavior. To sum up, we found that willingness to pay is not a single concept, and therefore a wage generally arises. We further suggest that observability is a potential factor influencing this divergence and, under certain constraints, reducing the gap. Potential extensions. In the process of doing this research, I came up with 2 extensions that I want to work on. The first one, about the removal of the equilibrium effects, is already solved, and the proof is in the appendix. The second one, in my opinion, is more interesting, in which I consider dynamic feedback and argue that, in surveys, a like null mechanism creates a systematic divergence. Unfortunately, this could be a much more complicated topic and hasn't been written about yet. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.